Hey guys, this is John, and I'm playing ChessBrain2014 in the 15-minute pool on ICC. He opens with d4. I'm trying to remember if I played this player before. I'm pretty sure I did. They have a peak rating of 22-21 in the 15-minute category. That's pretty good. And once again, we have an opponent who opens with d4. I'm just going to play knight f6 this time around. And if they play c4, I think I'll play e6. Okay, they're playing bishop f4, the London system. This is a line that a lot of people encounter at lower levels, and it's even popular on occasion at the higher level. By popular on occasion, I mean there's some diehard practitioners of this opening, and I think those players have proven that it's playable at all levels. Gatakomsky, for instance, is one player who comes to mind who plays the London frequently. So I played c5. This is usually a good way to attempt to meet the London because it prepares the queen coming out to b6 in many cases. Since the bishop is no longer on c1, it's not defending b2. So it's entirely possible that you could pop your queen out there and try to attack it. But I'm going to play this a little bit different. I am going to play b6 and bishop b7 very soon, and fianchetto this light square bishop. Yeah, I think I'm going to do it right now. This is a good flexible setup, and it's not entirely difficult for either side to play the resulting position, so I think we're going to wind up in a typical London middle game. At least that's my hope, and then I hopefully can explain some of the key plans. So white plays h3. Good move in order to save the dark square bishop. So if ever I play knight h5, he wants to be able to drop the bishop back to h2 comfortably. You'll see London players playing that move all the time. I think I'm going to be pretty pleased with the results of the opening, though. I don't think black has too many problems in this line. Yeah, he plays bishop d3. Here, I can play d6, or I can play my knight out to c6 right away. I think I'm going to play d6 just because I might want to wait one more move and see whether I should put the knight on d7 or c6. You can play it either way. I think the knight on c6 is a bit more active. Like in the event that he pushes e4, for instance, maybe I have a little more pressure on d4. Maybe I can play a capture on the d4 square and then move the knight into b4. But knight b7 is also completely fine. I'm just trying to remember what I've done in the past in this position, because I've had this exact position a couple times. My only concern about knight bd7 is that I become a little cramped, but I think it's okay. Yeah, I'm just going to play it. And look for me to adopt kind of a hedgehog-style pawn formation. I'll put my pawn on a6, and then I'll have a bunch of pawns on the 6th rank, controlling territory. White might have a little bit more space, but black has a rock-solid position. I don't think I have anything to complain about most of the time. Usually they end up putting the queen on e2. That's the proper place for it. It could go to c2, creating like a queen-bishop battery on a different diagonal, but I'm probably going to stick a rook on c8 opposing that queen. Whereas on e2, I could put a rook on e8, but there's so much stuff in the way, it's probably not going to make a difference. So e2 has been shown to be the slightly better square. Here I think I should play a6. Yeah, let's play a6. And I'm going to attempt to continue with queen c7 very soon too. He plays a4, that's typical. Yeah, and let's put the queen here. So now, one idea in the future that I might be able to execute is e5, and then after he takes, push e4, and try to fork the knight and the bishop. Even right here, it wouldn't work. Like, let's say I get one more move and I play e5. He could capture. I would take with my d-pawn. He moves the bishop back, let's say to h2, and I can't play e4 because my queen hangs. But it's a theme that has to be understood by both sides. I think one mini plan I can try to execute here is rook fe8, bishop back to f8, and then maybe g6, bishop g7. All right, he advances in the center, e4, inviting me to take on d4 if I want. Now I wish I had the knight on c6 so that I could take on d4 and then put the knight in on b4. But obviously that's not going to happen. So I could play e5 once again. I'm a little wary of having given up control over d5 in doing that. Still though, e5, if he takes, I can take with the knight or the bishop. or the knight or the pawn rather. It's probably okay. Likewise, I could play it solid with rook fe8 and bring the bishop back to f8. Just debating what to do. All right, let's play rook fe8. I'm going to keep the tension for a little bit. I won't push e5 yet. I won't take d4. He could think about playing e5, which would open the light square bishop. But let's say e5, I take with my pawn, he takes with his pawn, knight d5, attacking the bishop on f4. And then he retreats, maybe bishop g3. I think I'm pretty solid there. Bishop f8 maybe, or even knight f8 if I want to maneuver my knight over. Defending this pawn is a little pesky, I'm not going to lie. Okay, so here I could play that bishop f8 move again I was alluding to. I could also play e5. He's just played a useful move, rook fe1, useful in almost any case. My only fear about playing bishop f8 and keeping the tension is that he might advance e5, and after a swap of pawns, I might want that f8 square for my knight, is the thing. If I play knight f8 now, he can go e5. I take, maybe knight takes is then good. And he'd be threatening discovered attacks on my queen on c7. So do I play e5? That's the move I've been considering for 2 moves now. G6 is another possibility. Let's say G6 and he pushes E5. I take. He takes with the pawn. Maybe knight H5 becomes possible then. Bishop back to H2. I've weakened my F6 square, however, if I do that. Let's look at E5 again. So E5, D takes E5, D takes E5, bishop back to H2. Maybe bishop F8 in that case. Yeah, okay, let's play it. He also may not even take this pawn. He may just move the bishop back and keep the tension, but I'll probably still play bishop F8. This rook on the E file is helpful because when I do play the bishop back, it will kind of uncover another defender on that pawn. So he just moves it back. He's not saying yet whether he's going to capture. So I wonder if he's leaving open the option of playing pawn d5. Okay, I'm still going to play this move. So he could totally push d5 if he wants. We'd have a closed position. I'd like to push b5 in such a position, but it's going to be tough when he has both pawn, light square bishop, and queen guarding that square. If d5, more than likely I'd start maneuvering. I'd play maybe knight h5. Okay, so he takes. He opts to open it now. Do I take with the knight or the pawn? Kind of thinking pawn. Because if I take the knight and we trade, I just wonder if his queen can come to f3 at some advantageous time. All right, so let's take that way. Now, if knight c4, I have e5 sufficiently defended 3 times. So b5 comes into consideration. Let's say knight c4, b5, a takes b5, a takes b5. let's say rook takes a8, bishop takes a8. He could maybe snatch on e5 then, but I don't know if that's advisable. b5 could be okay for me. Although, is the following line a problem? b5, a takes b, knight a3. Attacking b5 multiple times. I have c4, but then I wonder if knight takes b5 could be played. Then I take on d3, they take c7, I take e2. Chain reaction of exchanges going on. I get the sense that should be fine. I'm going to try it, because if I don't play it now, I fear that I might not ever get this move in. So I'm going to try it and see what happens. Let's pre-move this capture. So he's got some things to think about now, like whether he wants to attempt to quote-unquote punish this move and play something active, like capturing on e5 or knight back to a3. Knight back to a3 doesn't look like an active move, but it does attack b5 multiple times. I could always push b4, I suppose, but I don't want to weaken b5 and c4. What I'm really trying to do with b5 is be able to advance pawn to c4 after this and attack his light square bishop and gain some space on the queen side. The position now resembles a Roy Lopez, like a closed Roy Lopez, based on the pawn structure, like some sort of Shigorin variation where black has pushed c5. I do got to look at this move order, because I think on move 9, the choice between knight bd7 and knight c6 could be more significant than I'm letting on. I don't play knight f6 on move 1 too often against d4 anymore. Like usually I'm playing d4, d5. So if d4, d5, bishop f4, it would have been a little bit different because I already have my pawn on d5 than what happened in the game. All right, so he takes and probably bishop takes. Yeah, I mean, if I take with a rook, he then can take on e5. If I take c4 right now, he takes e8, I take d3. Let's say he takes f8 check. Yeah, I'm coming out down material there, so I can't do that. We must play it this way. So one possibility for white here is to take on e5 and swap everything on that square and then try to win b5 at the end. We'll take a look at that line in analysis, but I don't think it was necessarily good for him, but he could consider it. All right, so here I can push c4, and I probably should in order to block this bishop out. Yeah, let's do that, kick it back. I wonder after that if I can take on e4. And if I were to do it, I have to take with the knight. Because if I take with the bishop first, he can swap bishops and then play knight d5, hitting my queen. But what if I take with the knight? It's an interesting question. May not be so bad at all. So knight takes, if knight d5, I just take it with my bishop. And if he plays something like some knight move, I have ways I can defend that knight on e4. I can play like knight f6 or knight c5 or maybe even pawn f5. At worst, I think he just has to scramble to get the pawn back after this move, unless I'm missing something. But no, I'm gonna call him on this and see what happens. Maybe I could have played knight c5 instead, but after looking at it for a moment, I don't see anything wrong with this move, so we're going with it. One tactical point is that if bishop takes e4, knight takes c4, trying to uncover an attack on my bishop on e4, I have the in-between move bishop takes f3, and I'll come out a piece ahead. We'll just pre-move that move just in case. He could switch that move order up. He could play knight takes c4 first, trying to win a pawn back without allowing that in-between move because my bishop would be blocked. But nope, he's going to g4 instead. All All right, so here I have to decide if I want to defend the knight or just move this knight and let him take e5. Even taking e5 could be a little dangerous for him, though. Because he might be in a pin down the e file. So what if I play pawn f5? If pawn f5, let's say knight g takes e5, knight takes e5, knight takes e5, rook takes e5, bishop takes e5, queen takes e5, and then if f3, yeah, I'm going to crush him on the dark squares, though. My bishop's coming to c5. That can't possibly be good. So I wonder if f5 is just a sound move for me. f5, if bishop takes e4, bishop takes e4, and then we do the same thing. I always have queen c5 at the end of that line. Yeah, that looks good. All right, show me what you got again. So just trying to prop this knight up. If the knight goes back to e3, I can play g6, a stabilizing move, and defend f5 that way. So the next few moves are going to be crucial because unless he comes up with something immediately, he might just be down a pawn. So the onus is on white to prove that their decision on move 19, knight e3, was sound. Time-wise, he's ahead. He's got about 2.5 minutes on me, but hopefully I can regain some of this. If he takes on e5, we're going to simplify the position. I don't think taking on e5 is good, though. I really don't. Let's run through that line one more time if he starts with bishop takes e4. So bishop takes e4, I should take with my bishop, because if I take on g4, he has bishop takes a8. And then if I take f3, he can come back with his bishop. Or even take with the queen if he wants. So that's no good. So bishop takes e4, bishop takes e4. Let's say knight g takes e5, knight takes e5, knight takes e5, rook takes e5. Now I'm pinned there, but I'm also up like a full piece at that moment. So he's got to do something to regain the material. So let's say bishop takes e5, queen takes e5. Now f3, as far as I can tell, would be the only consistent move there, trying to exploit the pin. But I have this queen c5 check move, getting out of the pin with tempo. And let's say he plays king h1. Okay, I'm going to stop calculating that line since it's not necessary anymore. So he brings the knight back to e3, attacking f5. I was just going to play g6, and I don't see a reason not to. Maybe he'll go g4 and make this crazy. It doesn't seem like a good idea, but he might play it. Knight d5, that's just a piece. That's a very strange blunder. Because the knight was on e3 earlier. I don't know why he would suddenly believe that that square was free, but that's just an out-and-out blunder. Weird. Well, that's 2 standard games in a row where my opponents have just kind of done things to their own position without a lot of prompting by me. I mean, there was no prompting for that blunder. In my last game, my opponent lost because they created a lot of unnecessary positional weaknesses. Okay, knight d4. I can't take this knight because of the pin, but a simple move like queen b6 or something should be sufficient. Yeah, let's just play queen b6. Get out of the pin, threaten the knight. He sort of has to go back to f3, and then I can play a move like bishop c5 and hammer the f2 point. Yeah, I would doubt he plays this on much further. This is completely lost. I mean, playing down the pawn would have been interesting. I'm just going to take this. There's no reason not to. I mean, he can get on the g file, but actually he can't. I have that square covered, but he can get on the h file. He can play queen h5 if he wants, but that also wouldn't have done much. Okay, let's just take this. For queen h5, I can play the queen over to g6, covering my rook on e8 and threatening mate. This is a tidy defense. I'm playing pretty fast, but still looking at any possible way he can trip me up. There's not a whole lot of ways, but I'm not going to overthink my defense. I'm up 2 pieces. Yeah, let's just swap the queens. And he resigns. Yeah, bizarre blunder, because what I was saying is that like it's weird that after the knight had gone to g4, having prior been on e3, that he would now think a couple moves later that knight d5 was possible. Bizarre. Okay, let's go back and take a look. So yeah, the London system with bishop f4. People like this setup because of like the system type openings that white can throw at you. This is probably the best or one of the best, at least in the d4 category. If you're a d5 player and they play bishop f4, I can recommend the move c5 immediately. This is a good antidote. And I was explaining the difference between how I would treat this position as black if it opened d4 d5 versus d4 knight f6. And in this case, I like playing c5 even quicker. One common line is e3. So let's say they prop up the pawn, knight c6. Let's say knight f3, knight here. A lot of times they play c3. Now, when they played c3, you have to be aware that they might try to take this pawn. So let's say black plays, I don't know, something like bishop f5 and white grabs. Because then if e6, the move that black would play to try to regain it, white can play b4. And that pawn on c3 helps defend. They have a structure that is going to take some dismantling from black. Whereas earlier, like on move number 2 here after c5, if they take, which is possible, you can play e6. And then after b4, there's various undermining moves, like you can play knight c6, or a5 would be a typical way to undermine the position. In fact, I think one line goes c3, a takes b4, c takes b4, and then knight c6. Point being that if they advance b5, you have queen a5 check, and you pick up the pawn. And they can't defend the pawn chain with a3 because you take, and this rook's undefended. So in the event of bishop f4 on move 2 against d4, d5, I do like c5. And that one line I was illustrating kind of goes like this. They play c3, and then you pop the queen out to b6, attacking b2. White can play queen b3, and then c4 is a good idea, offering a queen trade. But if they take it, you're happy with your play down the a file. And if they go back queen c2, you can play bishop f5, trying to deflect their queen from guarding b2. You just have to make sure that you play bishop f5 when your knight is already out on c6, if you're playing it as like a pseudo-sacrifice. Because I had one very embarrassing blitz game one time where I played it with my knight on b8. And after queen takes b5, I took on b2 and I got mated queen c8 because my knight was still here. So don't do that. But this is a common position. I think it's about equal. I'm not going to claim that black is like hugely better here, but equality is good if you're black in theory. So this is a way you can treat the London from the black side if you like, if you're a d4, d5 player. Likewise, after d4, knight f6, bishop f4, if I wanted, I could play d5 and try to get into a similar line. I just played a different line, though, c5. They went here. It's also possible to start with e6 if I was worried about, like, c5, d5 or something. But c5, e3, e6. Now, in this setup, I won't put the pawn on d5 because I don't want to block in my light square bishop. I've already played pawn e6, so it's unlikely the bishop's going to get out this way. It's so clogged up. So I wouldn't want to play pawn d5 because then my bishop is going to have a hard time joining the action. So I'm purposely not putting a pawn on d5 now so I can pursue this fianchetto. White played that h3 move so that if ever knight h5, they can drop their bishop back. Sometimes black tries to get in a very early knight h5 in this line. Like, let's say I had done it like a move before he played h3, like right here. I guess it's possible, although, well, I don't know. Maybe it's okay. I just haven't done it this early. Maybe it works, actually, because if bishop e5 trying to escape the knight, we have d6, and eventually it seems like the bishop's just going to have to drop here and black can take. Whether that gives black a huge advantage or not is debatable, but I guess if black is really keen on hunting down that London bishop, they can. But I just played b6 and fianchetto the light square bishop, castled. Okay, so this I'm not completely sure about, and I kind of expressed that hesitancy during the game, like whether to put the knight on c6 or d7. I've seen it played both ways, so that's kind of why I just went with one. I didn't have a strong reason to prefer knight bd7 over knight c6. Computer likes knight c6. Maybe this is just a more passive option. and that knight c6 could be just a little bit more active and therefore preferable. But I still feel like black's position is all right after knight b7. They played queen e2. Here I played a6. Possible I could wait on a6 until they play a4. Because after they played a4, they might want to advance pawn a5. And if I played a6 and they advance pawn a5, then I can push past with b5 without fear of losing the pawn. The a pawn would defend it. So in retrospect, maybe queen c7 is a little more flexible. But a6, they played a4, where I put the queen on c7, and they advanced e4. So I kept the tension for a move with rook at e8. And my plan was if they advanced e5, just to swap, and then say d takes, and then go knight d5, hitting the bishop. Let's say the bishop retreats, and then playing something to f8, whether it was the bishop or the knight. I kind of like the idea of the knight going to f8. I feel like it's going to be well placed on g6. Maybe it can help get into f4. If pawn c4, it's nice that I have this b4 square to go to with the knight, so my knight's not trapped. But I think he did the right thing after rook fe8 by just playing a move that kept the tension. He played rook fe1, if I recall. Yeah. And that put me in a little bit of a conundrum because, if I want to continue bishop f8, maybe now e5 is stronger because after take and pawn takes and knight d5, I can't as readily play this move. Yeah, in fact, he might even have sacrifices like this. That's a good point that the engine makes. King takes and then knight g5, the old Greek gift sacrifice. Because if king g8, now queen h5, threatening mate here, also threatening the pawn on f7. I'm just busted in that case. Whereas a move earlier, that wouldn't have worked because I would have had knight f8 as a defense. So like, also the bishop's on e7, but just to illustrate that, if e5 before, take here, now bishop takes h7 definitely does not work. Takes, and if knight g5, I could just eliminate that knight. Or, yeah, I guess I would have to eliminate the knight. I was thinking for a second, maybe in this case I could play knight f8, but they would still get at f7. So, but they played rook fe1, and I did play e5 now. They dropped the bishop back. They could take as well right away, but I think dropping the bishop back is fine. And now bishop f8. So the computer wants me to play c takes d4, c takes d4, e takes d4, so just trade a bunch of stuff. Knight takes d4, knight e5. I mentioned the similarity to the Roy Lopez, and that's a decision that black often faces in the closed Roy Lopez, particularly in that Chigorin variation. Black might have pawns here and here, attacking a white pawn on d4 that's defended a couple times, and black has to decide like whether they want to keep the position closed, like do no trades, or maybe take with a c pawn, or maybe take with a c pawn and then the e pawn, and swap everything. So I have a similar decision here. Likewise, this is kind of interesting too. Take with the e pawn, he takes with the c pawn, and then put the bishop back on f8, and maybe try to focus on my play on the e4 pawn. I could see why that would be possible too. That would be an unorthodox exchanging operation, but maybe it's worth something. But I just played the bishop back, and maybe he should play d5, closing the position down. Then the battle would shift to the wings. But one thing I like about his position is that he can utilize that c4 square for his knight. And I mentioned I want to get my pawn up to b5. That's going to be tough under these circumstances. But I took with a pawn. Yeah, knight takes was also possible. I was just a little worried that if knight takes, his queen might be able to come to f3, maybe as a way to disrupt this plan of g6 and bishop g7. So I took this way. Knight c4, and here I ventured b5. So the computer is still giving a nice advantage to white. It's been in white's favor for the majority of this game. Nothing too exciting, but a definite advantage. That kind of makes me think maybe I should have chose a little bit different of a setup in the opening. Maybe the knight coming to c6. But so a takes b5. This is all played. Rook takes a8. I want to take with a bishop, as mentioned, because I don't want to deflect my rook away from guarding this pawn. So bishop takes a8. And then they play knight e3, which seems to lose the advantage, and in fact swings it over to me. Okay. So knight a3 was the key move. Attacking b5. How does that work? Let's calculate for a second. I won't make these moves on the board yet. So one thing I was thinking about here was, after knight a3, playing c4. If he goes knight takes b5, I take d3, they take c7, I take e2, they take e8. What is going on there? Because then I could take e8 back, and I thought I would have 2 minor pieces versus the rook, which I do, but they have the c and the b pawns remaining. So in fact, it's a rook plus 2 pawns, the white rook plus the c and the b pawns versus my 2 minor pieces. And maybe that's just better for white. It's very possible. Let's see that line. So c4, knight takes b5, c takes d3. This is a forcing line, so we can calculate it. Here, I must keep the chain reaction going. They take here. I want to win the knight back. There's nothing doing with this pawn, so just take. And then, oh, okay. Yeah, they don't even have to take on e2 right away. They can take here as well. More trades. Probably I take e4 at the end. Rook takes e2. Yeah, and the computer thinks this is much better for white, which I would be on board with. Yeah, I mean, I think black's going to have a hard time against these 2 pawns, even though I do possess the bishop pair. I did see that if knight a3, I could always play b4, so that was in the back of my head. But in that case, the knight gets to come back to c4, which is just an awesome square for that piece. It's a great outpost square. From there, it can attack e5, and it blocks my c-pawn. And if my c-pawn's blocked, I'll have trouble getting some of my minor pieces into the game, like the bishop can't become active here, can't ever come out to c5, for instance. Maybe my knight is restricted a little bit. Yeah, I would say I'm definitely worse right now. B takes c3, b takes c3. It's difficult to find a plan for black. I'm tied down to e5 as well. So he missed his chance by playing knight e3 rather than knight a3. This could have been a moment where maybe white should have used a little bit of extra time. So knight e3, I advance c4. This is what I wanted to do all along when I set in motion my queenside pawns a few moves ago. So c4, attack the bishop. He's got to retreat, and now we take. Yeah, and it seems much better for black. I was looking at various discoveries from this knight. So, for instance, like knight takes c4. But, yeah, I can take here even, in between move on the queen. They take back, we take here. It's probably too dangerous for them to take this pawn, even though they have 1, 2, 3, 4 attackers on that square, and I only have 1, 2, 3 defenders. And what I mean by that is if we visualize this line, knight takes e5, knight takes e5, bishop takes e5, I think I have queen c6 there, threatening mate on g2, and also threatening pawn f6 using the pin. Although I'm not, well, yeah, pawn f6 might be a threat, because he might have to play f3. So what I mean is, let's say this happens. Computer says queen c5 is better, but I was thinking maybe this move. Attacking here. But they have queen f1 to defend, according to the computer. Okay. The black's only marginally better here. Yeah, because otherwise, like if they had played f3, then I think I have this move. Just exploiting the pin. Bishop e4, rook takes, take here, take here, take here. Yeah, and then I'm in a favorable endgame with the 2 bishops. But possibly there's an even easier way. Queen c5 check. Oh wait, no. It was saying that I move back. Instead of f6, check. Queen c5. Right. Because then they can't block with the bishop because we take here, and then we take their rook after they take the queen. Or even just take check. c5. So they would have to move their king out of the way, say king h1, and then f6, and we bypassed bishop e4 even. So white just loses a full piece. So there's some tactical lines, but essentially this kind of shows that once white has played knight e3 and I take on e4, it's hard for them to get the pawn back without allowing an even worse fate. So knight takes e4, and they just really floundered after this. I mean, I can't blame them. Their position is no longer good. If knight takes c4 doesn't work, based on that line we just looked at, then I think it's just clearly worse. If the best that they have is this, 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 and then not take the pawn on e5, black's just up a solid pawn, and I can look forward to trying to win this. Knight g5 is kind of active, attacking here and here. But I guess g6 covers. If the Greek gift sacrifice happens, it won't work. And if you want to try to figure out why, you can pause your video. But the reason why this won't work is that after king takes and then knight g5, king g8, queen h5, they are threatening mate here, and they're threatening the pawn, but I have knight f6, which covers both threats. No mate on h7, my knight guards, and the queen has joined in laterally to defend the f7 pawn. So knight g4, I played f5. Ooh, maybe f5 wasn't so accurate. For a second, it didn't like it. It was saying knight d6 instead. Knight d6 is maybe along the same lines as before, that taking on e5, while establishing material equality, leaves white bound up on the e file. Let's check that. Let's say this knight takes. Yeah, I can just play f6 again. This looks a little scarier because there's more pieces on the board. Like, I'd be looking at ways he can, sack on h7 or something, but I guess it doesn't really work. But I don't think there's much wrong with f5. Knight d4 is not a move I saw. The computer says he could try it. Attacking f5 and b5. And if I take here, he takes here. And remember, there's this pin, so that bishop lurking on h2 pins the e-pawn. I can't take that way. So knight d4 would have been interesting. But he went back to e3, and then I'm able to stabilize everything with g6. And yeah, I think white's counterplay, if any, is too little too late now. He doesn't have compensation for the pawn. That's a pretty big evaluation in black's favor. It's like more than a pawn in my favor, so positionally speaking, black is also much better now. Probably because I have more space and my bishops look better. Yeah, and here he committed a huge blunder with that, but it's difficult already. So, if you have any insight about whether to play knight bd7 or knight c6, let me know, because, as I said, I was under the impression that both moves are playable, but it might be possible. I mean, having played this game now, I don't know that I would repeat knight bd7. I might develop the knight through c6 if I got this position again. So, thank you guys for watching. I'll be back tomorrow with another video. Talk to you guys later. Bye.